Tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, welcome to everyone. This is day 25 of the hearings. These are hearings on proposed change 7, the Canterbury Regional Plan, and proposed change 2, the WRRP River Regional Plan. Our business today is the receiving of the reply report by the officers. And it's convenient. Now call on Mr. Moore, Council, to address us on the reply report, which we have already had in writing and of which we had some written exchanges. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, and good morning, Commissioners. For the record, the Council officers have produced a reply report dated the 5th of February 2021. Upon filing that report, the officers received a series of questions and provided responses in writing to those questions in a document dated the 24th of February. Following the provision of the response of answers to those questions, a further memorandum of counsel was lodged yesterday dealing with two matters that had arisen in the intervening period, the first of which was providing an updated technical memorandum in relation to the nitrogen floor, and secondly dealing with a scope question that had arisen in relation to forestry activities in flow-sensitive catchments. Now, the team of officers don't intend to read into the record any of the answers that have previously been provided to the panel. We understand that those have all been read and considered. We simply make ourselves available at this point in time to answer and respond to any additional questions that the panel may have of us.
Well, thank you, Mr. Moore. Thank you for your team for being present and considering questions that we have remaining. Commissioner Solomon, do you have any further questions that you'd like to ask now of the officers?
Yes, thank you. I just have 4 questions, and it's to do with managed aquifer recharge on the revised plan, policy 4.99. 1, please give an example of a functional need for the activity. It's a new revised wording.
If it is acceptable to the panel, there are obviously a number of people on the team, and we might shuffle some seats and have some different people coming up to answer questions. So if you bear with us a moment, we might confer for a moment as well, if that's acceptable.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCallum.
In terms of managed aquifer recharge and functional need for managed aquifer recharge at a particular location, an example could be...
Can I interrupt, please? Would the officer speaking identify themselves?
Yes, I'm Andrea Richardson from Environment Canterbury.
Thank you very much. Please continue.
So an example of a functional need could be improvements to groundwater quality in a particular catchment.
Okay, thank you. I kind of thought that, but thank you for clarifying that for me. And I'll just bring up my next question. And this relates to, this is a general question, and I noted it in Rule 5.189, Inanga spawning period. Is it from the 1st of March to the 1st of June, or is it from the 1st of March to the 31st of June?
I think there is some variation within the rules in the plan, but I don't have the answer to that at the moment, but I can respond to you.
I ask because I have seen some consent conditions that talk about the optimum inanga spawning season to be between the 1st of March and 31st of June. So I'd appreciate if you'd clarify that for me. And then in 33.22 of the reply report, the Cuss River B block allocation. And it says in the reply or answers to our questions, if the ecological recommendation for allocation is 20 litres a second and currently 290 litres a second is allocated, what is meant by sustainable in the Section 32 report, where it concludes that having a B allocation block for the Cuss River is sustainable?
My name's Angela Fenimore, and I'm the planner that helped prepare the Section 42A report for Part C of the plan change, including all of the Waimakariri provisions. It's my understanding that the reference to sustainability of the B block on the Cuss River was on the basis that it was from a hill-fed, the source was hill-fed, and that there is flow variability in those water bodies that would a B block can be appropriate. It might be useful to get some further information from our hydrologist and ecologist on that matter if you'd like some more information.
Thank you.
They're available in the room.
Hello there, I'm Mark McGucking. I'm the surface water lead for the Waimakariri. In response to your question, the use of that wording purely relates to hydrology, and that because the Cuss River is partially fed by hills, that there is water there to take as a B block. So there's high flow water to take. That's not making a commentary on whether there's good reason to take that water and what the effects of taking that water might be, but from a hydrology perspective, the water is there.
Okay, and my last question, and it's in, the panel asked, and it's in response to 34.4 of our questions we put to the officers from the reply report. The panel asked, is a take for Mahinga enhancement an NPSFM to 2020 objective 2.11c matter? And the officer replied that it is likely to be covered by this objective and primarily relates to cultural well-being. That being said, and after reading the Ngāi Tahu evidence, do you not think that cultural well-being relates to all three objectives? Because their evidence consistently talks about degraded water bodies and their ecosystems, which in turn affects Ngāi Tahu's ability to access kai fit for human consumption, putting their health and well-being at risk.
The officers agree that having a flow and allocation regime that provides for the health and well-being of the water body as a first priority would also provide for cultural well-being, and that it may provide for enhancement of mahingakai species, for example, and with the overall well-being of the water body. The allocation for mahingakai as an abstractive use, in my view, would fall under objective, should I have the right reference? Objective 2.11C.
So it was my understanding that a mahingakai allocation would at times remain in the river. So it's not always an abstractive use.
That's right. However, the rule framework does enable that water to be abstracted, and looking at that, I guess, as a worst case scenario, that's what we need to base our assessment on.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have. Thank you, David.
Yes, thank you very much. I've just got 9 questions I'd like to put to the officers, and you're going to have to bear with me because they jump around a little bit. So the first one is in relation to policy 4.101. So if you just turn to the track changes, the reply version of the track changes.
Policy number again?
4.101. All right. Oh, sorry. Okay, so now that policy is an avoid policy, unless, and then there's A through F. A refers to activities arising from the Waitaki or Coleridge schemes, but it has an and at the end, so I assume that A through F are conjunctive. So all of B and F just apply to the Coleridge and Waitaki schemes and nothing else. So that's quite a, what I might term a harsh policy, that any other activity must avoid effects on critical habitat, which could be quite hard to meet in reality. Was that the officer's intention?
Yes, it was. Yes, it is our intention that the effects management hierarchy, as defined in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, only applies to hydroelectricity generation activities undertaken by Waitaki and Coleridge schemes.
And so it's the officer's intent that all other activities resulting in sediment discharges, vegetation clearance, excavation or deposition of material or any other disturbance must avoid all effects on critical habitat.
Yes, avoid the damage or loss, yes.
Okay. And the next one is policy 4.102. And you don't, no, it's just on the very, just below that one. In your reply report, you didn't explicitly state your position, but it's shown as strikeout in the track changes. So was the officer's intent to delete that policy?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And now I just want to jump to rule 5.141. And this is just a minor point, but, oh, sorry, have you got that?
Yes, I do.
Yep. So you see in condition 3, it finishes with the words outside the mixing zone. And this may actually have been an issue that I raised very early on in the hearing, but I just note that Schedule 5 explicitly states within it that the standards it contains apply after reasonable mixing. So are those words strictly necessary?
I think that they could be admitted.
Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to jump over to table 14V for Victor. Whoops. So I understand the officer's recommendation to us is to adopt the AMWG full allocation regime as the primary series of restrictions, minimum flows, etc. But in the recommendations to us, you've indicated that you'd like to call that level 1, and then the first level of restrictions become level 2. I was just wondering if that might confuse the punters out in the field who are probably thinking full availability is what it is, and then when you jump to restrictions, you're in either level 1 or level 2, and that just might be a little bit confusing. And would there be any detriment in calling your level 1 full availability and calling your level 2 level 1?
I have no concerns about that approach.
Okay. All right. Rule 14.5.7 capital A. Now that's the rule that an activity would default to in terms of non-compliance with condition 4 of rule 14.5.7, I think.
Yes.
Now, condition 4 of 14.5.7 talks about interference effects being acceptable. But I think another provision relates to written approval being obtained. So should condition 4 relate to written approval being obtained as a demonstration of acceptability?
It's my understanding that acceptability, the threshold for acceptability is specified in Schedule 12, and that wording is used in Schedule 12. The idea of Rule 14.5.7a is that should the bore interference effects be considered to be not acceptable under Schedule 12, then it gives the opportunity for written approval to be obtained as that non-complying activity, at which point the effects could be not considered.
All right, thanks for that. I'll have a look at that later. Table 14ZC. Just need to find that. Just in terms of changing the date from January 2030 to January 28, when making that recommendation, did the officers do any assessment of the potential economic impacts of moving that date forward?
No specific analysis has been undertaken about that change in dates, but we do note that the economic evidence provided was that that first step was achievable.
Yeah. And that evidence, was that in the context of the 2030 date?
It was.
And can you recall whose evidence specifically addressed that?
We could look that up and come back to you.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be helpful, just if you could do that, thank you. Now, just a couple of minor points. Table 8-4. Whoops. So, you see in the row for the, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, the I River, EYRE River, in the B permit allocation it has a 0. Just in terms of consistency of wording with the table above, should that say no B allocation?
Yes.
Okay. And similarly with the transfer permit allocation, the 0 for Lees Valley, should that say no transfer permit allocation?
Yes.
Okay. Table 8A. Should be just up there. Oh no, I've put you in the wrong place. Sorry. Can we go to 14B, table 14B? Yeah. Now here, you've recommended changing the metric from percentage saturation, this is for DO, to a concentration. But in relation to table 8B, you recommended retaining percentage saturation. So there's an inconsistency there. Is there a specific reason for that, and is it a good idea to have that inconsistency?
Hi Commissioners, I'm Jared Arthur. I'm a Senior Water Quality and Ecology Scientist at Environment Canterbury. The question that you have relates to the OTOP region. I was mainly involved with providing technical advice for Table 8A and B, so for the Waimakariri sub-region. The reason that, from my understanding, the reason for changing Table 14A or 14B, I can't recall, to dissolved oxygen concentration was based on evidence supplied by Kate MacArthur from Department of Conservation. There is no reason that I can think of from a science perspective for those two tables to be inconsistent. That either dissolved oxygen percentage saturation or dissolved oxygen concentration would be acceptable.
I think I recall that the recommendation from that witness to move to concentration was to align with the MPS FM 2020, but it would be a bit odd, I think, just to have one table referring to that and everything else in the plan referring to a different metric. So maybe any change might be better left till council does its new water plan by 2024, perhaps, so you can address it consistently throughout the document.
That has generally been our approach.
Yeah. And one last question now on table 8-5. So I told you we're going to bounce around a bit. So this is this old the nitrate nitrogen issue. And so here the officers, you've recommended amending the limits. I think they're limits, not targets, to reflect the MPSFM 2020 values. But elsewhere in the reply report, I remember reading that other changes in that regard weren't recommended because there were no methods in the plan to actually achieve them. So this one sort of sticks out again as being a little bit different, but inconsistent. So two issues arise in my mind. Has any analysis been done about the achievability of these new targets? Is there a reason why we should change these ones and none of the others? And are there any methods in the plan to achieve them?
Right, so 3 questions there. The first is whether or not any analysis has been undertaken to about the achievability of these. And yes, our technical team provided the panel with some information on the reductions required to achieve the new national bottom lines. I can provide you with a date that was provided to you. I recall it was in November and was tabled with the hearing panel in that time. The second question, you might have to remind me what that is. My apologies.
I think elsewhere in the reply report where similar changes were sought by submitters, the officers said no, that we shouldn't do that because there were no methods in the plan to actually achieve them. So you'd sort of have a target with no regulatory means of getting there.
The reason why we recommended to reduce the nitrogen concentration limits and targets in table 8-5 was on the basis that we had a number of submitters requesting much lower nitrogen concentration limits and targets. So firstly, we had scope where I understand there was very limited scope of the same regard for the section 14 provisions. Secondly, we do have a series of methods in section 8 that assist in achieving that limit and target, being a series of reductions in nitrogen loss over time and also enabling provisions for other mechanisms such as targeted stream augmentation and managed aquifer recharge. We understand that the technical analysis shows that reductions in nitrogen losses alone may not achieve those limits and targets, but they are a very good first step to get us on the pathway to achieving those.
And then just the last issue, I guess I'm not sure if I enunciated that earlier on, was just in terms of consistency within the plan. Would these limits then be quite different from all the other ones that have nitrate nitrogen limits for rivers?
Sorry, do you mind repeating that question?
Yeah, so if we were to adopt this recommendation and to lower the targets actually to the values recommended to reflect the MPSFM 2020, would this table then be quite different to all the other water quality tables for rivers? Would they still have the previous numbers, like 6.4 instead of 3.5, for example?
Yes, the other tables will have a number of values in them that do not comply with the new national bottom lines. We acknowledge that there is a consistency issue here. This one was certainly finely balanced as to what to recommend for Waimakariri. But the specificity of the submissions that were available and the extra analysis and methods available pushed us towards that recommendation to make the change. But as I say, it was a finely balanced one in terms of consistency on the other hand.
So I guess in your mind then, were you trading off the issue of consistency against the specific nature of the submissions and evidence received? And then you decided to go with the inconsistent approach on that basis?
Yes, it is a sub-region, and I don't think there is a compelling reason for consistency, given that it's a sub-region that is by definition intended to be dealt with specifically.
Yeah. All right, thanks very much. That was all.
I would like to ask another question, and this concerns the notion of a definition of the term spring. Now, what I'm asking in relation to this doesn't relate to what the definition should be. It relates to whether there should be a definition of that term. My understanding is that the plan itself does not contain an explicit definition of the term spring. And it's my understanding that as a consequence of that, the term is taken to have its ordinary dictionary meaning. In quite general dictionaries, including the New Zealand dictionary, the New Zealand edition of the Commons English Dictionary, have descriptions of the meaning of the term spring in this context, which seem to be quite consistent with the kind of definition that the witness filing form proposed, and also seems to be generally consistent with the technical definitions that special dictionaries have. So I'm wondering if the council does not intend a meaning that is different from those, is there any need to insert a specific definition in the plan, specifically for the Oton and Waimakariri sub-regions? And if there is to be a definition just for those sub-regions, is that to be inferred that the term is intended to have a different meaning in those sub-regions than elsewhere in the Canterbury region?
On the face of it, it would appear that the definition that we have recommended and the dictionary definition are quite strongly aligned. The question that I would want to confirm is this element of our definition that we have included here about discharging into a surface water body either on an intermittent or permanent basis. The issue that we have had with springs is the point at which they become sufficiently significant to actually become part of a water body, as it were. And that's what we have tried to capture in that definition. I would need to have a look at those dictionary definitions, which I've not done so, to confirm whether this definition is redundant.
Yes, one of the technical dictionaries, I'm looking at the Oxford Dictionary of Earth Sciences, suggests that where the flow is not distinct, does not give rise to obvious trickles, but tends to be somewhat dispersed, that the flow is then more correctly termed a seep. But the technical dictionaries do consider, as does the General Dictionary by Chambers, whether intermittent flows are part of a spring, and that seems to be accepted that they are.
On that basis, then that definition that you have described would appear to cover the ground.
So you see a problem if we just don't have a definition of spring.
My only concern is that at page 34 of the plan itself, it states that the words in this plan have their ordinary meaning set out in the Oxford English Dictionary, in the brackets, second edition of the Oxford English Dictionary online, except where they're defined in the RMA, the RPS, or this plan. So my only concern would be that it does specify a particular dictionary definition if it's not defined here, and that wouldn't allow consideration of those technical dictionaries that you were discussing.
All right, thank you for that. So where does that leave us in terms of the advice that we're given by the officers? Do you want to have specific definitions for Otop of Waimakariri and none for the rest?
We would need to just reconfirm the definition in this specific dictionary, which I apologise we have not confirmed that it is. So we'd need to have a quick check of that. We're mindful that the use of those terms spring in the rules apply in or were changed in sections 8 and sections 14 of the plan and not elsewhere. So that was the reasoning to put it in here rather than put it in the general definitions and apply to the whole plan. Whether that would have raised some unintended consequences was our concern there.
Yes, well, I understand the caution. Is it going to be better if we invite you to come back with a further message on this once you
Thank you.
got that extra research?
Excuse me, Chair. Sorry, is that mic on? Excuse me, Chair, could I just ask a follow-up question if you're ready to leave that particular topic?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner.
So my recollection of the issue which arose was the practicality of some of the rules that referred to springs, and this wording was designed to try and address that, so to limit the impact of some of those rules to what might be called sort of more significant springs. So if there is to be no definition, and just thinking about the discussion that you just had, would it then be appropriate to go to the rules themselves, and where the word spring is used in rules that might generate a practical problem of implementation, that the wording, that the spring in those rules is qualified as necessarily being flowing into a surface water body either on an intermittent or permanent basis. So put that exception in the rule rather than in the definition, which is probably the more general policy approach.
That would certainly solve the issue from my understanding.
So if you're going to do some further thinking on that, it'd be good to know which rules then, which policies or rules that the exception might usefully be placed in, just as an option. Thank you, Chair.
Is there any other business before us now? There are one or two loose ends on which we'll receive some additional advice in writing.
In relation to the issues that remain outstanding, the officers are of the view that if we were to take a short, say 15-minute adjournment, we would be able to provide responses to all of the outstanding questions today, such that you could then hopefully be in a position to close the hearing. If that would be convenient to the panel, then my suggestion would be that we take that adjournment and provide the final responses now whilst we have everybody available.
That sounds a very practical suggestion. Thank you very much, Mr. Moore. We'll adjourn to quarter of an hour.
Thank you.
Are we ready to proceed, Mr. Moore?
Yes, we are, and thank you for the indulgence. There were 5 matters that the officers had flagged as requiring a further response, the first of which related to Commissioner Solomon's question about the dates for Inanga spawning sites, and I invite Mr. McCallum-Clark to provide an answer to that question.
Inanga spawning typically occurs between 1st of March and 1st of June. The plan rules typically use those dates. There are some dates in the plan that are from January through to June, and those dates that are earlier are ones that protect vegetation upon which the inanga spawn, so that it has a chance to grow to a type that they use for spawn, that the inanga uses for spawning.
The second outstanding issue related to a date on which a memorandum was provided with respect to the achievability of nitrogen reductions, and I'm reliably informed that it's a memorandum or a technical memorandum dated 9 November 2020. The third outstanding question related to economic evidence, and a question was asked as to the source of economic evidence, and I invite Mr. McCallum-Clark to address you on that question.
That information is in 2 places. It is at section 10.3.3 of the section 32 report, and there is also an economic assessment that formed part of the ZIPper or Zone Implementation Program Addenda technical reports. I can also confirm that Ms. Sullivan for Dairy NZ, in response to questions, identified that the first stage was considered achievable.
Yeah, thank you for that. But I think my question was posed in terms of advancing the date rather than support for the notified date. So I think my question was or was that a different question?
Sorry for my misunderstanding. there has not been any specific technical reporting of advancing the date from 2030 to 2028.
Okay. And so that evidence that you just cited was in support of the 2030 date as notified.
That is the early technical reporting around the notified date, yes.
Yep. Okay. So the answer you just gave, was that in relation to my question on table 14ZC? Don't want to be confusing either you or me with thinking you're answering a different question.
Yes.
Okay, yep. Thanks.
The fourth question relates to the need for a definition of spring, and I invite Mr. McCallum Clark to address you on the definition, having now had an opportunity to consider the online Oxford English Dictionary definition.
That definition reads, a place where water emerges naturally from the ground, the source or head of a stream or river, the supply of water forming such a source. My impression from that definition is that it is quite broad and would not necessarily exclude consideration of what we've talked about in terms of a SEEP, which the officers would suggest should not be included in the definition of spring. So on that basis, officers would prefer to have either a definition of spring, as we have recommended to you, or as Commissioner Morthausen has suggested, it could be incorporated into rules 8.5.33 and 14.5.25, which are the stock exclusion rules in each of the subregions, to exclude those springs where there is no connection permanently or intermittently to a water body.
Well, thank you for looking into that for us, for advice.
The final matter outstanding does not relate to a question this morning, but relates to a point of clarification in respect to the replies given to questions, and it's that most recent council document dated the 24th of February 2021. On page 13 of that document.
Yeah.
You will see there some red text referring to a Schedule 33 legal descriptions of land for policy 14.4.19 capital A subparagraph A, and then there's reference to some 3 lot and DP references, but there are a series of X's indicating that the particular land parcel descriptions were not known at that point in time. The particular lot and DP references will be able to be provided to the panel today in the event that the officer's recommendations with respect to Schedule 33 are accepted by the panel.
So they'll be provided today, because you won't know what the panel thinks about it for some time.
Yes. They'll be provided in writing. I don't have that information to hand to provide it to the panel now, but I'll simply have that provided to the hearings officer.
Yes, to complete an omission from the document, which is understandable.
Yes. And those were the only outstanding issues from the questions today, unless any further questions have arisen in the interim.
Anything further, Commissioners?
No, not from me, thank you.
No, not from me either, thank you.
Well, now, thank you for that, Mr. Moore. I just want to be clear that we have now dealt with the business of the hearing, and that there's no other business for the hearing before I come to the closing part. All right. Well, it's appropriate after 25 hearing days to offer some appreciations. And first, and this is not a mere formality, the Commission is grateful to all submitters. The submissions, and there were hundreds of them, were prepared carefully and thoroughly and in a way that represents serious matters to be raised. Many of the submitters took the trouble to come and take part in the hearing process to be sure that we understood what they intended by these submissions and to answer our questions. The whole process would be pointless if there were not people willing to make submissions to contribute to the improvement of the plan changes in the way that they saw appropriate. So it's a matter of grateful thanks for all of the submitters and particularly those who took part in the hearing. Next, we should acknowledge the part that a business called Shipley's have had in enabling the hearings to proceed with only an image of the chair rather than my personal presence. So thank you to Shipley's. More substantially, I mentioned the hearing manager, Ms. Fernando, whose skills and talents have been obvious to us all as the hearing has proceeded, and whose contribution has been essential to the success of it. This morning's part of the hearing has reminded us, though we would never have forgotten, of the value of the team of officers. Mr. Moore and Ms. Edwards, Mr. McCallum Clark, and all of the numerous officers, some employees of Environment Canterbury and some consultants. The complexity of what has been asked of them has been enormous, and yet we've had complete conformity with what seemed to us to be time limits that would be stretching them. So I do want to particularly thank you all, the members of the team who are present today and those who are not present today, but all of you, your part has been very valuable to the commissions. So thank you indeed. And finally, I would also wish to mention Ms. Cook, the Principal Planning Advisor, whose skills and talents you all will know, and whose part has been invaluable to the process that we've been carrying on. So with those appreciations, I can now announce that the hearing of the submissions on Plan Change 2 and Plan Change 7 is completed, and the commissioners now will proceed to consider and deliberate on all of the issues involved and prepare a report which will be presented to the council as soon as it's completed. So that completes our business this morning. Thank you very much for your attendance.